There is a particular kind of fame that Britain reserves for very few people. The kind where a single first name is enough, where grandmothers and teenagers alike know exactly who you mean the moment you say it. For more than 65 years, that name has been Cliff. Not a surname, not a stage persona, just Cliff, the boy from a council house who became the most enduring pop star his country ever produced, a man who has now lived through more decades in the British charts than most of his fans have been alive. But behind the clean-cut smile, the gospel songs, and the Christmas number ones, there's a much quieter story. One of displacement, of a scandal that nearly destroyed him, of a lifetime spent choosing solitude over marriage, and now, at 85, of a body finally beginning to tell him that time is not infinite. This is the real story of Cliff Richard, and how he lives now might surprise you more than anything you remember about him. Harry Roger Webb, the boy who would eventually be renamed for the record industry, was born in October 1940 in Lucknow, in what was then British India. His father worked in the catering trade attached to the Indian railway system, a job that came with a level of comfort colonial families took for granted. Household staff, a settled home, a sense of permanence that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with an empire that was already starting to unravel. Harry had 3 sisters, and for the first 7 years of his life, India was simply home. He didn't know yet that the ground beneath that home was temporary. In 1947, when India gained independence, the entire structure that had supported families like the Webbs collapsed almost overnight. Thousands of British families who had spent generations in India suddenly had no clear place there anymore. The choice facing them wasn't really a choice at all. Stay somewhere that no longer needed them, or return to a country most of the children had never actually seen. The Webbs chose Britain, packed what little they could carry, and made the long sea cross into Essex. What awaited them was not the England of anyone's imagination. There was no house ready, no job waiting, no soft landing. The family moved in temporarily with relatives before eventually settling into a modest council house. For a boy who had grown up with domestic help in a warm climate, post-war England was a shock in every sense, cold, rationed, and unfamiliar. Money was so tight in those early years that the family often ate simply because there was little else available. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the highlight reels of Cliff Richard's career, but it shaped him. He has spoken since about how those years taught him not to take comfort for granted, and how the instability of that migration left him, even decades later, drawn to routine and control in a way that fame rarely allows. School gave him some stability. He was a capable student, good enough at athletics to play football at a county level, but it was a sound coming out of America in the mid-1950s that actually captured him, the raw, electric thump of early rock and roll. His parents found the music baffling, even distasteful, the kind of noise that decent households weren't supposed to encourage. But when his father relented and bought him a guitar, something shifted. Within a couple of years, the filing clerk job he took after leaving school became irrelevant. Music wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a plan. It's worth pausing on just how unlikely that plan seemed at the time. Nothing about a teenager from a cramped council house, with parents who thought rock and roll was a passing embarrassment, suggested a future built on stadium tours and royal honors. He wasn't part of a musical family, hadn't trained formally, and had no connections to the recording industry. What he had instead was an obsessive appetite for the records coming out of America, a willingness to imitate and then adapt what he heard, and a group of equally hungry teenagers around him who wanted to try building something similar in Britain. He sang first in informal harmony groups, then briefly with a local skiffle outfit, before deciding he wanted to front something of his own. That decision, to stop being a member of someone else's band and become the person other musicians backed, turned out to be the first quietly deliberate step in a career built almost entirely on careful, incremental choices rather than lucky accidents. There's a detail that tends to get lost in the retelling of his rise. Before any record executive noticed him, he had already changed how people addressed him. The name on his birth certificate wasn't the one that would eventually appear on record sleeves and concert posters. A manager suggested the switch, arguing that the industry needed something sharper, more marketable, easier to print in bold letters above a marquee. He agreed without much resistance. It's a small thing, but it says something about how quickly he learned to treat his public identity as something separate from his private self, a distinction that would matter enormously decades later. when the public version of him came under attack in a way the private man never expected to survive. By 1958, an 18-year-old performing under the freshly minted stage name Cliff Richard walked into a recording session that would define the rest of his life. The intended single was an American cover song, expected to be the hit. The song tucked on the other side almost as an afterthought. A track called Move It was the one that actually caught fire. It shot up the British charts. And almost overnight, the United Kingdom had its first homegrown rock and roll star, a British answer to the sound that had, until then, only ever seemed to come from across the Atlantic. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and sustained careers in the history of popular music. Cliff Richard would go on to chart in every decade from the 1950s through well into the 2020s, a run shared by almost no one else in music history. He would rack up dozens of top 10 singles, more Christmas number ones than any other artist, and record sales that eventually passed 250 million copies worldwide. He was knighted. He toured 5 continents. For the British public, he became something closer to a national fixture than a pop star, reliable, wholesome, and seemingly permanent. What made his longevity so unusual wasn't just a raw number of hits, but his willingness to keep reinventing the sound around him without ever losing the audience he'd already built. He moved from the raw rock and roll of his teenage breakthrough into more polished pop in the 1960s, took on film roles that turned him into a genuine matinee idol, leaned into soft rock and adult contemporary sounds in the 1970s and 1980s, and later folded his faith directly into his music with hymns and worship songs that reached the top of the charts in a way almost no other mainstream pop star's religious material ever has. Where many of his contemporaries from the late 1950s either faded from view or became nostalgia acts trading almost entirely on old hits, Cliff kept producing new material that audiences actually bought decade after decade. That's part of why chart statisticians still point to him as a genuine outlier. Not just an artist who once had a great run, but one whose commercial relevance simply refused to expire on any normal schedule. Behind the scenes, he built a reputation in the industry as remarkably disciplined, famously abstemious compared to many of his rock and roll peers, someone who avoided the excesses that ended so many of his contemporaries' careers early. He didn't drink to excess, didn't chase the kind of tabloid scandal that trailed other stars of his generation, and treated touring less like a party circuit and more like a job to be done properly night after night, city after city. That discipline is part of what allowed his body keep performing into his 80s in the first place, but also meant that when scandal did eventually find him, in 2014, it landed on a man who had spent an entire career deliberately avoiding exactly that kind of exposure, which made the impact all the more disorienting. But permanence in the public eye is an illusion. Underneath the hits and headlines, Cliff Richard was quietly building a life defined by things the audience rarely saw. A deep, increasingly central religious faith, a series of relationships that never became marriages, and a growing comfort with being alone that would only be tested later in the most public way imaginable. In the mid-1960s, Cliff Richard became a committed Christian, a decision that would end up shaping almost every choice he made from that point forward, including, by his own account, his decision never to marry. He has explained many times over the decades that he believed marriage required a kind of total commitment he didn't feel he could give while touring the world for months at a stretch. Rather than enter a marriage he suspected he couldn't fully show up for, he chose not to enter one at all. There were other reasons, too, ones that sound less abstract and more personal. He liked his independence. He liked being able to make decisions about his own schedule, his own home, his own time without needing to account for someone else's life running alongside his. And there was a more cautious, almost offensive logic sitting underneath it. A reluctance to risk a failed marriage, which conflicted with the depth of his religious convictions. Better, he reasoned, not to marry at all than to marry and watch it fall apart. None of this meant an absence of love. In the 1970s, Cliff was open about the fact that he had fallen for the Australian singer and actress Olivia Newton-John, at a time when much of Britain seemed a little bit in love with her too. But she was already involved with someone else by then, and the moment passed him by. One of those quiet near misses that never becomes public property the way a marriage or a breakup does. Newton-John would go on to marry twice, including, in an odd twist, a marriage to one of Cliff's own close musical collaborators. Despite that, Cliff and Olivia remained close friends for the rest of her life. and their bond outlasted almost every other relationship either of them had in the industry. There were other important women in his life, too, a long romantic connection with a tennis star turned broadcaster that stretched back to their respective heydays in the 1970s, relationships with dancers and actresses that never quite cross a line into anything permanent. He has described his younger years, without much embarrassment, as having had a fairly colorful romantic life. But colorful is not the same as settled, and none of it produced a wedding, a shared household, or children. For years, the public's response to a famous, attractive, unmarried man was predictable. Speculation about his sexuality followed him for decades. Cliff has consistently declined to treat the question as anything other than irrelevant to who he actually is, arguing repeatedly that his private life belonged to him, and that the endless curiosity said more about the public's discomfort with an unmarried man than it did about him. That refusal to explain himself on other people's terms is, in its own way, consistent with everything else about how he's approached fame. He has never seemed particularly interested in managing public perception for its own sake, which is unusual for someone who has spent an entire career dependent on that same public's goodwill. He built a career on being liked without ever really auditioning for approval on questions he considered private. It's part of what made the events of 2014 so jarring for him. For the first time in decades, the public conversation about his personal life wasn't something he could simply decline to engage with. It was suddenly the only conversation happening about him at all, everywhere, all at once, and there was no version of quiet dignity that could make it stop on its own. What's more striking and far more human is something Cliff admitted much later in life, long after speculation had died down and the tabloids had moved on to other targets. He has said, in a way that sounds almost startled by his own honesty, that he sometimes wonders whether choosing a life without a family meant he would never really know what it is to be loved in that particular, daily way. Not romantic love. He's clear that he experienced plenty of that, but the quieter, less glamorous kind. Someone who is simply there in the evenings, someone whose presence doesn't depend on a concert schedule. He has talked about coming home from the stage to an empty house, the applause still ringing in his ears, and feeling a silence that fame was never built to fill. If Cliff Richard's early life was defined by displacement, and his middle years by an extraordinarily consistent professional rise, then a single week in August 2014 came close to unraveling all of it. The origin of the crisis reached back nearly 3 decades, to a 1985 religious event at a football stadium in Sheffield, where a teenager in the crowd would, years later, allege that Cliff had assaulted him. The claim eventually made its way to London's Metropolitan Police, who were at the time deep into a much larger investigation into historical abuse allegations across the entertainment industry, a wave of scrutiny that had been triggered by earlier scandals involving other well-known figures. Given that climate, any new allegation against a household name was treated with heightened seriousness. The case was passed to South Yorkshire Police for investigation. Cliff denied the allegation immediately, and he never stopped denying it. But denial couldn't stop what happened next. In August 2014, South Yorkshire Police prepared to search his penthouse apartment. Before that search even took place, a BBC journalist had learned the investigation existed, and what followed would later be picked apart in excruciating detail in a courtroom. An arrangement was reached, in effect, between the police and the broadcaster. The BBC would hold off publishing the story in exchange for being given advance notice of exactly when a raid would happen. Both sides would later dispute the word deal, but the practical result was unmistakable. On the day of the search, a helicopter was already circling overhead, ready to broadcast live footage of police officers going through Cliff Richard's home. Cliff wasn't even in the country. He was on holiday in Portugal, and he learned that his home was being searched the same way millions of television viewers did, by watching it unfold live on his screen. No one had warned him. No one had given him the chance to prepare, to call a lawyer, to simply be present for what was happening to his own life. He watched it from a hotel room, thousands of miles from home, utterly powerless. The investigation would drag on for nearly 2 years. Throughout that time, Cliff maintained his innocence, cooperated with the inquiry, and waited, while his career, his charitable work, and his sense of safety in his own life slowly eroded under a cloud that had never been proven, and, as it would turn out, never would be. In June 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service finally announced its decision. there was insufficient evidence to bring any charge. Cliff Richard was never arrested. He was never charged with anything. Legally, the matter was closed entirely. But a reputation built over more than 50 years doesn't repair itself simply because a prosecutor declines to press charges. The footage had already been broadcast around the world. The headlines had already run. And for a man whose entire public identity had been built on the idea of wholesome decency, the damage of the accusation, even an unproven, ultimately unsupported one, had already been done in a way no formal announcement could undo. Cliff didn't simply try to move on quietly. In 2016, he took the unusual step of filing a lawsuit against both South Yorkshire Police and the BBC, arguing that his privacy had been violated in a way that went far beyond ordinary press coverage. The case took nearly 2 years to reach London's High Court, and when it finally did, in the spring of 2018, the details that emerged about how closely the police and the broadcaster had coordinated the timing of the raid were, by most accounts, worse than anyone had expected. The judge's ruling, delivered in July 2018, was unambiguous. The BBC, the court found, had seriously and sensationally infringed Cliff Richard's privacy rights without any legal justification for doing so. The police were found liable as well. Substantial damages followed, well into 6 figures from the broadcaster alone, with an additional penalty tied to the fact that the BBC had gone on to submit its coverage of the raid for a broadcasting award. South Yorkshire Police had already agreed to a separate financial settlement before the trial even began. When legal costs and the broadcaster's contribution toward them were tallied on top of the damages, the total ran into the millions. But Cliff Richard has always been clear that no amount of money in that judgment came close to compensating for what those 2 years actually cost him. He testified that the ordeal, including lost work and legal expense, had cost him millions of pounds in total. But the number that seemed to matter most to him wasn't financial at all. It was the 2 years themselves, years he could never get back, years spent under suspicion for something that never happened. The toll on him personally was severe enough that it entered directly into the court record, described in his own words rather than filtered through a publicist. He lost a significant amount of weight during the investigation, not through any deliberate effort, but simply because the stress wore his body down. He developed shingles, a condition frequently triggered by prolonged anxiety and disrupted sleep. He has described nights where he woke repeatedly, running the same imagined conversations over and over in his head, and days where an anxious, tight feeling in his stomach simply never let go, regardless of how many times he reminded himself that he had done nothing wrong. At points, he genuinely feared he might be on the verge of a heart attack or a stroke. He has even described moments of looking in the mirror during that period and feeling as though the reflection staring back belonged to someone else entirely, an older, more depleted version of himself that he didn't fully recognize. He never returned to live in the apartment that had been searched. In his own words, the place had become contaminated to him, not physically, but psychologically, in a way that made it impossible to think of it as home again. He went back only once, to collect his belongings, and even that visit was difficult. He has compared the experience to having been burgled before, and said this felt worse, because a burglary at least happens privately, not broadcast to the world while you watch helplessly from another country. Professionally, the fallout touched almost everything. An album release was disrupted, a planned update to his memoir was shelved, and years of charitable work he cared deeply about were thrown into disarray. He became acutely aware that people in every part of the world where he was known might now assume the worst about him, an awareness that followed him long after the CPS cleared him. Legal exoneration, it turned out, doesn't reach everyone who saw the helicopter footage or read the early headlines. Many people simply never got the update. There's a particular cruelty in how the timing worked against him. The allegation itself dated back to 1985, decades before it ever surfaced publicly, which meant Cliff had no memory to defend, no alibi he could easily reconstruct, nothing concrete to point beyond his own consistent denial. For an investigation rooted in a much larger, much darker pattern of real historical abuse uncovered around the same period, that ambiguity worked against anyone accused, guilty or not. The public appetite for believing accusations was, understandably, running high after genuine wrongdoing by other public figures had gone unpunished for decades. Cliff Richard became, in effect, caught in the machinery of a moment that had very good reasons to exist, but that had no reliable way of distinguishing a false accusation from a true one until an investigation actually concluded. He has never suggested the police shouldn't have investigated the claim at all. What is consistently objected to is a decision to broadcast his identity and his home, live, to the entire country, before any charge had even been considered, a decision that turned an unproven allegation into a de facto public verdict, regardless of what any court might eventually decide. In the years that followed, Cliff largely withdrew from public life. The man whose entire career had depended on being visible, on being in front of an audience, found the spotlight had turned into something closer to a threat. He has said since that one motivation for pursuing a legal case wasn't really about the money. It was a hope that by fighting it, he might make it a little less likely that someone else would go through the same experience. He has argued publicly that no one's name